Good afternoon, Excellency, distinguished guests, dear friends and colleagues. My name is Elena Kunturi-Tapiero. I'm the acting regional representative at the United Nations Human Rights Office in Brussels, and I would like to warmly welcome the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Volker Türk, to Brussels. We are very pleased to have you. We are in magnificent surroundings. This is a unique 15th century Gothic building, still standing in the center of Brussels, the multicultural capital of Europe. I wonder what life was like for the inhabitants of Brussels at the time. Well, the 15th century was a time of great upheaval. The city was successively under the Burgundian, Spanish, Austrian, French, and Dutch until independence on 21st July, 1831. At the time, of course, kingdoms and empires across Europe were won or lost through the unions between the offspring of European royalty. For example, Philip II of Spain arranged the marriage of his favorite daughter, Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia, with her cousin, Archduke Albert of Austria. Both were educated at the Madrid court and chosen to co-reign over the Low Countries, including Belgium. And hence, I think Article 16.2 of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights is appropriate. The article reads, "Marriage shall be entered into only with the free and full consent of the intending spouses." I wonder to what extent Infanta Isabel and Archduke Albert were consulted, let alone freely and fully consented to their marriage. I'm particularly pleased that we have with us Lydia Mutebele from the Town Hall, and I'm also very pleased to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Elena Gomez Castro, Ambassador, Representative of Spain to the Political and Security Committee of the Council of the European Union. Spain is currently chairing the rotating presidency of the European Council and has made human rights and gender equality as one of their priorities. We're very pleased to join with you for this event today to commemorate Human Rights 75. The High Commissioner, Mr. Volker Türk, will be interviewed by a journalist, Ms. Sophia Stewart-Leeson, who is Capital's editor and Dutch correspondent for Euractiv. My esteemed colleague, dear friend, Ms. Sherry Aldis, director of the UN Regional Information Center for Western Europe, will moderate a question and answer session from you, the audience. So please don't be shy. You have 30 minutes to think about what you would like to ask the High Commissioner. During the Human Rights 75 campaign, we pay specific attention to youth and what the declaration represents for them. As the next generation, they will carry forward their dreams and aspirations, looking ahead to the next 25 years. What will the world look like in 25 years? What role will human rights play in your lives? Will there still be humans? How will you interact between you? How will you interact with the planet? Will the planet exist the way we know it? You can ask these and other questions at the end of the interview. Thank you for coming, and it's my pleasure to welcome the Ambassador of Spain for some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Excellency, High Commissioner, distinguished guests, thank you very much first for having invited the Spanish presidency of the Council of the European Union to be here today with you. This year, two major human rights anniversaries coincide: the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 30th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration and its programme of action, which established your office, High Commissioner. By adopting the Universal Declaration in 1948, the world set out equal rights for everyone, everywhere. The declaration was signed by all UN member states. It was a historic moment. Discussions leading to these declarations were, however, far from smooth, but in the end, the world agreed on their universality, interdependence, and indivisibility of human rights. There is therefore no hierarchy of rights amongst them. All human beings, wherever they live, have these rights and are entitled to have them protected. Moreover, this declaration laid the foundations of legally binding human rights treaties and established universal standards, which were incorporated into national constitutions and domestic legal frameworks. We can never take human rights for granted, however. They have always been challenged and frequently violated. Repression and persecution continue to be widespread, hindering the most fundamental rights of millions of individuals in many regions in the world. This is particularly relevant concerning the full recognition and equal enjoyment of human rights by all women and girls. And today, Europe is unfortunately no exception. The Russian war of aggression against Ukraine has been a stark reminder of the vulnerability of human rights also here in Europe. Spain has just assumed the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. Human rights are rightly the keystone of both the Spanish and the EU's foreign policy. That is why they are one of our horizontal priorities of our presidency. Our efforts will concentrate on three key areas: the protection of human rights defenders, the furthering of democracy, rule of law and media freedom, and the fight against death penalty. First, we fully acknowledge that human rights defenders anywhere in the world are also defending our liberties. They are our first line of defense. This is why Spain was one of the first countries to develop a temporary shelter program program for human rights defenders at risk almost 30 years ago. We will continue promoting the effective implementation of the EU guidelines adopted in 2004 and modified in 2008. Second, the furthering of democracy, rule of law and media freedom. Synergies will be promoted for pro-democracy actions regarding third countries, strengthening coordination within the framework of such groups as Team Europe Democracy. Third, the Spanish presidency will pay special attention to international and regional initiatives aimed at abolishing the death penalty, promoting the participation of civil society and other stakeholders, such as the private sector, which should play a major role in eradicating this practice. These efforts will focus on those states which have yet to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in the Mediterranean, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Two major events will frame our presidency. First, we will host on 4th of October in Madrid a high-level event to celebrate and commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. We hope, High Commissioner, to count you amongst our esteemed guests. Second, we are celebrating during our presidency the 25th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, and Spain will host an international seminar in Madrid on the provision of visas for human rights defenders. Let me conclude. Events like today's, right here in the heart of Europe, allow us to raise awareness of the importance of human rights in a fast-changing world and of the new challenges still ahead related to new technologies and climate change. They help us build and convey our narrative. Dear High Commissioner, human rights are universal. Human rights are law. Human rights are international law. You can count on Spain and on our presidency to lead the efforts towards the defense of human rights inside the EU borders and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I would now like to invite High Commissioner and our journalist, Sophia, to come to the podium for the interview. Thank you very much.
Is it on? Yes, perfect. Good evening, everyone. We're here to speak with Volker Türk, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Commissioner Türk has been in his post since last October and brings with him a long career within the UN system where he has dedicated his time to advancing human rights across the world, including traveling to Sudan to assess last year's political transition on its people, calling out the severe violations in Ukraine following Russia's invasion, and his continued efforts to tackle gender-based violence. The Commissioner also previously held posts within the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in different regions across the world, including Malaysia, Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I thought we could start with an assessment on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we'll start with this. In the aftermath of World War II, on 10th of December 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This year marks 75 years since that adoption. Sounds better, right? Yeah. In 75 years, how much have we really achieved in the field of human rights since its adoption, and what are some of the main challenges faced today?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here in this magnificent building, and in a way, the portrait behind us, I think, reminds us quite a lot about some of the origins of the human rights movement. Because if you go back to the origins, you will see that the labor movement, and then I'm coming to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, the human rights movement was nourished by the labor movement, by the different revolutions that we had. Of course, the French, the American, the Haitian revolution. Sometimes we forget that there was basically a revolt by Haitians against slavery, racism, against colonization 215 years ago. And it was a real uproar against that repression. And we always mention the American and the French revolution. We forget about the Haitian revolution. But then you had so many other movements. You had the gender feminism. You had feminism as a very important source of the human rights movement. You had movements around LGBTIQ+. You had anti-apartheid movement. I remember still in my own years how important the anti-apartheid movement was, and the whole decolonization movement. So all of this, with the experiences that the world went through in the first half of last century, now I think you're right, it sort of keeps changing the tone. The world went through 2 horrible world wars. It went through a massive recession and a depression. It went through genocide, the Holocaust, and out of all of this emerged this text that different countries at the time negotiated. And it was interesting because you always hear about Eleanor Roosevelt, but there were actually a few other women delegates who participated, including an Indian woman, Hansa Mehta, who was the one emphasizing human rights, not the rights of men, but human rights, because she knew that if you write it differently, it could be seen that it's only one half of the humanity that benefits from it. So there was also this very important contribution from the Global South when it comes to human rights issues. And then, yes, this was a fantastic, it's the most translated text in the world. It's in the Guinness Book of Records. There's no other text that has been translated in so many ways than this one. And what it has inspired is that it has inspired movements of liberation. It has inspired movements of against repression. It has inspired, the fight for freedom in many countries around the world, including Sudan, by the way, because the Sudanese, it was young people and it was women who were at the forefront of overthrowing a 30-year-old military dictatorship in 2019. And they were at the forefront precisely out of this willingness. We are fed up with the repression. We are fed up with what we have to experience, and we want to fight for our freedoms, and that's what they did. I think if you look at what we have achieved, there is not one single aspect of our lives that isn't originating from the human rights movement. And we should sometimes think about it, because especially in our parts of the world, in Europe, in the industrialized world, we benefit enormously from this. And it is our duty to make sure that we also find ways and means that other parts of the world benefit from it. And that's still unfortunately, what we have to fight for.
Great, that was perfect. Thank you. And since you're here with us in Belgium today, I thought we could start with a local question. Currently, 27% of Europeans think that rising prices and the cost of living is one of the two most important issues facing the EU, and it's very much felt here in Belgium. So my question to you is, how can greater focus and investment be put on economic and social rights when on the one hand the cost of living is increasing, but salaries do not follow, as is felt in Belgium?
So I think it's interesting that in Europe, we are going through this experience. Higher living costs, inflation that affects the lives of people. And I don't want to diminish the concern that people have, but I have to tell you that the vast majority in the world has gone through hell during the COVID pandemic and in the wake of the COVID pandemic. You have to imagine that there were many countries that depended, for instance, on tourism. The tourists didn't come for 2 years. So a lot of countries in the global south, and in particular, the most vulnerable populations in the global south were suffering enormously. And they went through this cost of living crisis. They went through inflation. They sometimes didn't know how to make ends meet. And there was not enough response by the international financial system to respond to their needs. And that's one of the big lessons learned from the COVID pandemic, that we need social protection floors, that we need a new emphasis on economic and social rights, that we need, and in Belgium, I understand you have an indexation where on wage pensions that is actually sort of commensurate with living cost increases. Some other European countries actually don't have that. So there's some mitigation, but it is clear that economic, social aspects are critical from a human rights perspective, because we also know that most marginalized, the most vulnerable groups within a society, the unemployed, often single women households, young people, are more affected than others. And there needs to be, within the social system, enough checks and balances precisely to respond to their needs and to their rights. But I can tell you, we are facing it here. It's nothing compared to what many countries around the world in the global south are facing today.
Now, I think we can...
I hope it leads to more solidarity as a result. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Add as much as you want. I hope that's not my microphone. Well, for the next one, I'd like to zoom out a little more. So you've touched upon the EU quite a few times now, so I'd like to focus on an EU-level question. I think it might be mine. And I'd like to focus on migration. So migration has been one of the most contentious issues for the EU since the 2015 migration crisis, when the bloc tried and failed to overhaul the bloc's process for welcoming and relocating asylum seekers. The EU has also absorbed 4 million refugees from Ukraine in the last 2 years, and migrants continue to attempt to cross the Mediterranean Sea at a great personal cost. Sorry, everyone. At a great personal cost. As could be seen by the recent tragedy that we saw off the coast of Greece. So my question is, how can we better protect the human rights of migrants, and how can we counter negative attitudes and opinions vis-a-vis migrants in Europe?
Maybe it works if I turn it off when you speak, and maybe it's because there seems to be some interference. Look, it's a very personal thing for me, because I have lived a large part of my life with refugees and with migration issues. And I've lived through 2015 when what you call a crisis, which is what I call the fact that Syrians and especially Afghans came to Europe under often abominable circumstances, because, they took to often unseaworthy boats. I mean, we saw it in the Central Mediterranean, but we also saw it, of course, very much in the Eastern Mediterranean from Turkey. And it is great, and I'm very happy that Europe has hosted the 4 million Ukrainian refugees, and that's very important, and chapeau to that. By the way, in terms of relativism, after the end of the Second World War, you had 60 million people displaced refugees, internally displaced, or migrating within the European continent. So sometimes when we talk about millions, let's not forget the history. You had 60 million people who were not at home. So we can manage this if we want to. I have also seen that in the political discourse, this issue has become very fraught and very polarized and very binary. And I wish we could bring to the debate more the facts, also the global dimension, the solidarity that it requires, and of course the human rights dimension, but also the fact that if we look at aging populations in Europe, I mean, I went home a couple of weeks ago to see my aging parents. My father had a medical thing, and when we went to the hospital, most people in the hospital, the nurses, had a migration background. We're not Austrians. Most people who are in the care, who work in the care professions, are actually people who have a migration background. And I know that there is not enough of people who have that, who are in the care profession, who are working in a number of economic areas. And I think we need to realize in Europe, we need to bring it back to rationality. I mean, we need to actually deal with what we are faced with. And we know the demographics are such that it's also in the enlightened self-interest to have a discussion about migration that makes it clear to our own survival that we cannot survive without it. Of course, then there are the tragedies that you have just mentioned in Greece, we don't even know the exact circumstances yet. I found, from the media perspective, I found it very telling that you almost knew second by second what was going on with the submarine that detonated or was, submerged in the waters off the American coast or of the Canadian coast. But we had American coast. But we didn't even, and we probably knew the family members. We knew how many children each and every of the people who were in that submarine had. But we don't even know the names of the 700 or 800 people who died. We don't know what their background was. We are so desensitized to the plight of people. We don't know their stories. And I do think we need to really work on this, because we need to understand it much better. We also need to find ways and means to address some of the migratory pressures. A lot has to do with inequalities and inequities at the international system. And it has also a lot to do with sometimes a lack of solidarity with countries in the global south. At the same time, we need to find ways and means to engage with migrants and refugees from a human rights perspective and from a perspective of understanding. But I missed that in the debate, I'm afraid.
Okay, I think it's back on. Yep, great. Thank you for that. I'd like to move the conversation towards youth participation here in the EU, as we have you here for a second. As migration is at the heart of European politics, and we've all started to look towards the EU elections, the question of who decides where the EU is going is paramount. Youth activists are pushing for better recognition of youth's voices and needs in European policymaking, while also making sure young people feel safe to participate. For example, Belgium and Germany recently joined Austria, Greece, and Malta in allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in the European elections. So my question is, what are some more concrete actions member state governments could take to promote participation within the next generation? And what can officials do to ensure that young people are interested in European or international affairs?
For me, one of the most important matters that I deal with is precisely to ensure that young people are interested in politics. Because if you are not, you will have others decide about the type of things that have gone wrong over the last couple of decades. So I welcome very much political participation and political knowledge of history, because I also think that sometimes if we don't know the history, it's very difficult to do politics without knowledge of history. But also just this engagement of, yes, we can change things. We can actually, we don't have to accept what we are told. We can find different ways of engagement, and we need to find a safe space for this to be done. And so I have a lot of very high hopes when it comes to young people. I mean, I just looked at the statistics. We have 1.9 billion young people between the age of 10 to 24 in the world. So you can imagine what a force, what a political force that is. In our own surveys, when you ask young people, and it would be interesting to know what you are all saying about this, what are your biggest concerns? Of course, climate change comes up, the whole triple planetary crisis. Also, your own future when it comes to employment, education, and so forth, and human rights. I actually find it interesting that human rights has come back to the key concerns, because it is also what makes us tick and think about when we are confronted with situations around the world that are very different. And it makes us then question ourselves, well, if that's happening in Sudan or in Ukraine or in Haiti, don't we have to ask ourselves how we connect with this and what our contribution is to make things better in other countries? And I do think that that's a very important point for young people. So when it comes to the UN itself, we have promoted very much meaningful youth participation. In our own, in our Human Rights 75 initiative, we have also tried very hard to have an advisory group of young people who come together and actually participate, and also are a bit the mirror to us. I see it in many other parts of the UN as well. So this massive investment in young people, in what we can do for them, and how we can make sure that the political space is there for them to be able to participate is incredibly important. So I think I welcome the fact that the voting age has been lowered so that young people can participate. But we also need to make sure that the quality of participation is guaranteed as well.
Is that about, yep. You talked a little bit about youth participation over in your offices and projects. Are you having more young people excited to work on your projects and more people in your offices that are younger and younger?
Actually, we do, but it's that the UN rules, and that's part of the problem, because we had an internal discussion within the UN. We are not yet equipped for it. The good thing is the General Assembly, which is the big organ of all 193 member states, decided to establish a UN Youth Office, which gives it a proper place, which means part of their task is precisely to look at our own recruitment procedures so that younger people can actually be recruited at a much earlier age, and they don't have to go and wait for, and that we are more flexible when it comes to that. But it also is always an issue, and I won't bore you with it. It, of course, also requires member states to agree to it. But yes, it's a big issue for us.
Well, I thought we could round up your answers and maybe do a quick look towards the future. So in your view, for, I don't know, in the next 25 years, what are some key considerations that will most impact the defense and promotion of human rights?
Politics, and we have to translate human rights into politics, and they have to be part and parcel of governance, of whatever governance means, meaning how we interact, how the state interacts with its citizens and how citizens interact with the state. Of course, the triple planetary crisis, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And it also means learning lessons from history, because what the fossil fuel industry did for decades is basically throw dust in our eyes by telling us that climate change is not what it is, and by financing massively and lobbying massively for a denial policy. And there is a very interesting book I can recommend, Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes, who describes for the tobacco industry and then for the fossil fuel industry what type of methods they have used so that politics would not actually do the right thing much earlier on, so that we are not faced with the situation that we are faced with today. And I think there are lots of lessons to be learned from that. I mean, I can't even imagine, because you could even, there are some who would say ecocide is a thing we need to look at very carefully, especially in this anniversary year, what ecocide means in today's world. So that's absolutely key. But also the whole digital side. We know that, you have seen with generative artificial intelligence what the potential is to find solutions. We are not going to be able to deal with the big challenges of climate change if we are not using digital technology and technology more generally. But we also have to be very clear if that power is given away in such a manner that it can run awry or amok because of profit, again, we have to be very careful. We had the lessons learned from the social media platforms. There weren't enough human rights guardrails attached very early on. They came much later when, already conflicts erupted. I can tell you, Myanmar is a good example, where you had Facebook. They had one person who spoke the local language for content moderation, but you can see the effect of it. And so we need to learn, especially when it comes to generative AI, that the human rights guardrails have to be in place so that abuses and misuses are prevented right from the start. And that's still, we are already almost too late for that.
Well, I've actually reached the end of my questions, so I'd like everyone to give a quick round of applause for his answers here. Thanks, Commissioner. Now it's time to move to the Q&A portion. This is going to be moderated by UN Regional Information Center for Western Europe Director, Sherry Aldis.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, High Commissioner. Really very happy and grateful to have you with us this evening in Brussels. It's a unique opportunity for all of us to be able to interact directly with you. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions from the people in the audience. In order to make sure that everybody can have their question answered, I will ask you to be brief, to introduce yourself before you ask a question. And looking forward, I think this was a great kickoff, and we really broached a very wide variety of topics that I'm sure that we can deepen now. So we would also like to mention that the event is recorded, and there will be also a cocktail afterwards. But before that, we have an opportunity to ask questions, so please do raise your hand and introduce yourself briefly if you would like to ask a question. So we have two questions, one here and one there. We can start with you.
Is it working? Yeah, it's working now. Eliza Rotanowska, the International Federation for Human Rights. It's a privilege to be able to be here and to ask the question. And I wanted to start by saying that I welcome the link made between the current discussion around the refugees to the politics, actually, because we are on a continent right now that seems to have been surrounded by cemeteries from the south, from the east at the moment as well. And what is actually really concerning is the fact that there has been differentiation made between different, it's horrible to say, but types of refugees. And this links to my question. How would you address the issue of radicalism also amongst young people who are participating, but their participation is leading to a furthering of these issues, of these problems, and the threat of redefining human rights and the UN Declaration, actually, for human rights, of human rights? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Margarita Götze von Heiking, and I'm currently working at EES in the digital division. And my question is, so, for instance, over 2 billion people under the age of 2 billion people under the age of 25 actually don't have access to the internet at home. We have a huge digital divide in the world. And this is also affecting the full enjoyment of human rights, for instance, the right to education, the right to freedom of expression, etc., etc. And I think you said before that maybe now is the time to reinforce this right to access, right to connect as a human right and not just as a privilege. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you see this could work? And also, if we actually manage to establish this as a right, how is this going to be realized? Thank you.
Look, on the first question, I mean, we need to understand what extremism and radicalization is all about. And we need to do a very deep analysis of it. And there are different reasons for it. Sometimes it has a lot to do with fear. It has a lot to do with not managing to deal with the complexity of our world, being overwhelmed with it. But also, I'm afraid to say, sometimes and this is both for, I don't think it's an age question, because some of these social media platforms have also allowed people to be stuck in a groupthink mentality and essentially in silos and echo chambers from which it's difficult to get out. I think for the education system of the future, and that's why sometimes we are lagging behind. When we see digital developments, we don't quite see what the consequences of them are on the type of responsibility that we have in order to create the awareness and the mindfulness to deal with it. And it's almost like, we have to grow. There has to be a certain maturity when you use certain tools. And we have seen a huge lagging behind on them, certainly when it comes to social media platforms, because we can only benefit from an open and free exchange of views in order to advance what we are doing. So we also need to listen to what other people's views are. But what we have essentially done, we essentially reduced ourselves to one single opinion. It's often very binary. We're not challenging ourselves enough, where you are constantly fed with often wrong information. We saw it during COVID, for example, that eggs you on and makes you even more convinced of sometimes absolutely false beliefs. And that's very dangerous. So we need to find ways, and if you talk about digital divide, because there is actually a connection, the digital divide is unacceptable and is one thing that, for instance, in a big summit of the future in the UN, we hope to be able to overcome. But there needs to be a lot of discussions also with industry about it. But the digital divide has to be accompanied with quality access, not just access, it's also quality access. There's a certain literacy that is required when you use certain tools. And that, frankly, has been lacking, which is, I think, why we see the lack of an open space, the drifting into areas that are quite dangerous, into influences that bring back among young people. I was shocked to hear about some of these influences that, for instance, often represent a very macho, misogynistic type of worldview, and even young people follow it. And we don't have enough guardrails in place to prevent this from happening. And that's, I think, there we have to our own consciousness has to evolve a lot more. And there we have a lot of work to be done, which is why when it comes to AI, we need to be absolutely clear what the guardrails are on the human rights front. And they are complex. These are not easy questions. But yes, digital divide has to be overcome, but it has to be done through equality and literacy type approach. Otherwise, you can also wreak havoc.
So My name is Nadia Haddad. I'm the co-chair of the European Network on Independent Living. And so it seems like today we are celebrating 75 years of the Human Rights Treaty bodies, but it seems like the Human Rights Treaty body concerning the right of person with disability is still missing. Legislation is still on anti-discrimination and not based on human rights. So we are in Belgium, for example. Belgium has the leadership in building still from today on in 2023 special schools for children with disability from young on. They are segregated. On European level, we also see there is still a lot of funds that are used from public money to build institutions, to put those people separately. So my question to you, how can we ensure that those member states who ratified the Convention of Human Rights are still lacking in implementing it, and the impact on it is still huge for the moment? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Maudine Tamboué from the People of African Descent in Belgium Organization Observatory. You've mentioned all the dimension of human rights from where we come from, where we are, but I think we also, how do you see how you can work as an institution on the systemic disadvantage, systemic inequalities, because if we have to move on in 25 years, as you say, for the youth, if we focus on digitalization without focusing on institution systemic renovation, I would say, we will inherit, I'm not sure that we go for the better. Today, human rights is also a systemic disadvantage, systemic not access to rights that has consequence in over the diverse dimension. As Ms. said, it can be disability, it can be access to education, it can be justice. Here recently, we've seen what that means in France, for example, where known as the country of liberties, but when it comes to systemic racism, they still struggle to work and discuss.
Good afternoon, Diego Naranjo from the European Digital Rights Association, which is a network of 50 organizations working to defend human rights online. I wanted to ask, I see there's a parallel rise on one hand of securitization policies. We see that at the border, we see the attacks on encryption, we see the use of spyware, including against human rights defenders in Greece and Spain. And we also see at the same time a rise of the far right across Europe. So I wonder how the Office of the High Commissioner sees this potential grab of power by far right governments with all of this immense power on surveillance, against encryption, against privacy, and many of these other digital rights.
Look, on the first issue of people with disabilities, I mean, as you know, there is a UN Convention on the rights of people with disabilities. It's a very important one. There's also a treaty body attached to it. We have done, especially in this year, in the 75th anniversary year, a lot of activities to ensure that more states accede to it, that they actually sign up to that treaty, because we know that it's one guarantee to ensure that rights of people with disabilities are better respected. And then you also have to go through the, this process of state party reports, where states have to report back on what they have done. I don't know whether Belgium signed, I don't know, did Belgium sign it? They did. Sorry? They signed it in 2000. So, I mean, that's already very good, because what happens is, on a regular basis, Belgium has to provide a report back to the treaty body, which is independent experts that are nominated by states to examine state reports, and they will go through all these various aspects. And there is a strong push for all of us to make sure that the recommendations and the concluding observations of the treaty body are respected. In my own office, I can tell you, it's for us a priority. And in many, where we actually have an office, because I don't have an office everywhere. We have an office in about 100 countries, but sometimes it only means one person. But for us, it's one of the focus populations of concern, and we have done a lot of work to make sure that there is more awareness. And it links a little bit to the question about the systemic nature of racism or of discrimination, because it is systemic issues that need to be addressed. I mean, in order to deal with and in order to fulfill the rights of people with disabilities, you actually need to have in place a whole governance arrangement that responds to it. The same on, we have, over the last couple of years, a number of mechanisms that were established on people with of African descent. There's a permanent forum now, which is very important. There's also an expert group. And it has helped. I think it's become much too late, but it has at least helped to advance some of those issues. And there's also this expert mechanism that now travels to different countries to provide the comparative advantage of what's happening in other countries around the world in order to address precisely the systemic issues. But it's still a lot of work in progress, and we need to be very much aware of it. And I fully agree with you. I mean, of course, inequalities today are horrific, the inequalities that we see in the world. If we are not managing it in the next 25 years, we will see a lot of problems. And it's definitely an area of concern. I mean, inequalities, need to be tackled, and they need to be tackled at so many different levels, which, by the way, is why we have launched this concept of a human rights economy. I don't know if you heard about this, to actually look at economic models from the perspective of how they deliver to people, not how they gain profit or gains, but actually how do they deliver to the rights of people. And that goes very much also into this whole discussion about racism, discrimination, understanding where inequalities come from and how can we better address them. One of the big worries that we have when it comes to generative AI is precisely the possibility to use facial recognition, prejudice and bias, encryption and spyware to do all kinds of harms. And I think one of the dystopian pictures that we could see emerge is precisely that, which is why the guardrails are so absolutely important. I mean, Europe, you have a discussion in the European Union going on about an artificial intelligence act or regulation, I don't know, act. And that's really important. But frankly, the EU is far ahead of what other parts of the world are doing. And I really hope that it could actually be a model for other parts of the world as well, because it goes into the human rights issues. And it's really key, because it goes also precisely the type of challenges that you have identified, and they are real.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about the Métis children born during the Belgian colonization. My name is Claudine Jadot, and I'm one of 3 children born to a Belgian father and a Congolese mother during that period. So during the late 1950s, the Belgian state implemented a policy of forced child removal and racial segregation in its colony of the Congo in the United Nations mandated region of Burundi and Rwanda. So as children, we were victims of abduction and deportations, and our mothers weren't allowed to have any ties with us, their children, and ties were cut with both the European and the African family. So all this just because of race. So the Belgian federal government made it clear from the start there would be no financial compensation. But so far we have obtained some administrative reparation, but hardly any psychological support. So we want real reparations, and we would like reparation as defined by the United Nations Special Rapporteur. So we have been making this demand for many years without the Belgian state hearing us. So, Mr. High Commissioner, what more can we do in the face of a state that refuses to provide repair for its crimes? What role can the High Commissioner play in urging the Belgian state to provide adequate reparation for its crimes? Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner, for taking the time to be here and talk today, and also for giving the floor for us to ask you questions. My question is, how can we further the advancement of human rights, considering that historically, or many also would argue that human rights were appropriated, dominated, and basically instrumentalized by big Western powers to further their own interests. Think, for example, the Iraq War. And then also the parallel trend that we're seeing today of authoritarian regimes precisely using this argument of the hypocrisy, essentially, of Western countries interfering in domestic affairs, especially given, the history. So, thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thanks a lot for taking the time to discussing with us. I have a question. My name is Laura Mitsari, by the way. Currently at the European External Action Service, but I have a question from a more personal point of view. And I want to ask you about reproductive rights, because we say, if we look at the world, we see the erosion of these rights in several states around the world. And also, even if we look at the Forum of the United Nations, for example, at the General Assembly, we see that at times, the notion of reproductive rights doesn't get included into resolutions anymore. And if we take together this picture we have on the national level and also on the international level, what is your assessment of the situation? What can be done to still safeguard these human rights in the future? Thank you so much.
I think what you have raised is an important part of the discussion that we have had before about looking at not just the discrimination that currently exists against people of African descent, but also historically. And reparation is part of it. And you will see this in all the expert advice that comes from the international system. So I'd invite you to link up with precisely these fora to see what can be done about that. The instrumentalization of human rights, it's interesting because it is true. There was a time after the beginning of the Cold War where there was a real split in the understanding of what human rights means. For some, it was only civil and political rights. It wasn't economic, social, and cultural rights. And it was used, especially at the time when the Global South came back with requesting for a different international economic order, beginning of the 70s. And they asked for solidarity in a different way because, they were also disadvantaged for centuries and exploited for centuries in the colonization process. Suddenly, you wouldn't hear much about economic, social, and cultural rights. And it's also interesting in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was Eleanor Roosevelt, an American, the First Lady, her husband, and it's sometimes forgotten in the US history, that her husband, Roosevelt, when he was president, in 1944, actually declared a Bill of Economic Rights. But somehow this was forgotten with the beginning of the Cold War. So you had this split. It was an ideological split. It didn't help us at all, but Eleanor managed to bring economic, social, and cultural rights into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, even against her own State Department at the time. It's an interesting story because she fought against her own State Department to say, well, you can't put this in, because it was already the beginning of the Cold War. And somehow she managed to get it in nonetheless. So as a result, we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that is clear about the interdependence and the interrelationship between civil, political, economic, social, and cultural. And we need to emphasize this as much as we can. And when it comes to the autocracy and the autocratic tendencies that we see, is what I like to often quote back to them is actually the Charter of the UN. The Charter of the UN spoke about principles, purposes and principles, and has identified, apart from peace and security and development, human promotion and the fulfillment of human rights. So it was absolutely clear that you needed to promote that as part of what the UN stands for. And it could not be considered, human rights were not an interference in domestic affairs. We need to remind everyone who uses these arguments today that human rights concern us all. They are not a matter that is just for the one state. It's a matter that concerns us all, as it should concern us when we see people drown in the Mediterranean, or it should concern us when we see people suffering in a war in Sudan, or, and that links me up to women's rights and bodily autonomy, on when it comes to the loss of sexual and reproductive health rights. Frankly, I'm stunned that even in the West, in some countries, what I thought would have been achievements that don't get discussed anymore because no one even in their right mind would think of questioning them, that they suddenly get that the achievements that we have had over the last few decades, that they get questioned again. But that's why politics comes in and history comes back in, because all these issues were thought through and fought through for quite some time, and they were done for a purpose. There was evidence behind it. So I can only encourage all of you to know the history of it and to see where it is that we were coming from and go back to some of those basics. And I mean, it's one of our big concerns as well on sexual and reproductive health rights. And I can tell you, we have been, I mean, from my side, from the Human Rights Office side, we have been absolutely clear about it. And I mean, even if in some documents you see less mention, it's still an acquis. It's still something that is the current state of law in order to respect sexual and reproductive health rights. And it sometimes also gets reduced to abortion, access to safe abortion. It's much broader. We know that in conflict situations, I mean, if you don't have sexual and reproductive health rights for pregnancy, sorry, I have to bring it closer, sorry, then you have a huge issue. And sometimes, unfortunately, it gets forgotten, but it has to be seen as an integral part of the right to health and of health systems.
Thank you, sir. I have a question. I'm Capucine Paquet from the Human Rights City Network, and we have seen a lack of common understanding and communication between civil society and local governance. And you mentioned, in fact, the importance of having a link in order to enhance solidarity facing human rights challenges in Europe. And I was wondering, what are your views in order to enhance this solidarity by creating a better link between civil society and local governance, which often don't have that common understanding on human rights challenges? Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Shanna Boltov. I also work at the EAS as a trainee for the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. You mentioned some challenges regarding to human rights in the digital sphere. You mentioned generative AI. My question is more on neurotechnology. I know your office is working on it. And given the potential threats to human rights, to freedom of thought, mental integrity, but also it touches more of the core of our being, of who we are as human rights. My question is really, do you think neurotechnology has the potential to change the very nature of humanity? And do you think existing rights have the potential to protect us from these huge challenges that are awaiting us? So thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Iria Castro from Protection International. We are an NGO working on the defense, collective defense of human rights defenders. We are very good, as it was mentioned, I think, in the international solidarity in supporting human rights defenders individually and at high risk. But we are a bit less good when it comes to prevent reaching the point where relocation is needed. And in your experience, which creative ways or which supporting projects have you seen that really support collectives? Because the defense of human rights is mostly collective rather than individual, to address this risk and manage this risk before we need to get to this level of risk in which we need to take people out of their countries. Thank you.
Look, well, first of all, which brings us back a little bit to the discussion we had about social media platforms. In order to be able to address the big challenges of our times, including at the very local grassroots level, we need this constant dialogue and participation and meaningful participation. The right to participation is a human right. And it means, I see for a friend, Gonzalo, here with us from UNHCR. When we do actually programs for refugees, we have this age, gender, diversity approach, meaning that even the UN, when it gets involved, needs to be very clear and involve the people that we serve, basically. And that goes for any governance model. It's almost this deep democracy concept. I don't know if you've heard about deep democracy, which means meaningful participation at the very grassroots level. To bring human rights in, there was a trend I think it started maybe in the 70s, to have human rights cities. I don't know whether Brussels is a human rights city. It is? I see someone nodding, someone not nodding, but anyway, if it is, but I actually think we need to rejuvenate that concept of what a human rights city is, and it would start with participation, and it would start with civil society engagement, which I'm sure is happening, but maybe, of course, it can be done much more, but there are things that could be done with human rights cities, and they bring it a bit also to this point of human rights defenders, and I will come to the neurotechnology point in a minute. Because human rights defenders, my own experience with human rights defenders, and also now, both in my previous professional life, but also today, they know, we should trust their own instincts the most. They know when they are at risk. They sometimes know that they need to take risks. Otherwise things won't change. I always hope that the UN, either my office or whenever we are not present, also other offices, could provide the safe space for them. But I can tell you there are situations, even today, where I'm very worried that we can't do it. And we as the UN have to be very clear about that too, because we may give a wrong sense of security that we can't provide. I think of one country in particular, Mali, for example, where in the current situation, it may be very difficult to provide the type of support that we need to provide to human rights defenders. I know of one case or a couple of cases where we actually had to evacuate people out of harm's way. But again, the local level is often, we also see, the safety within local communities, sometimes also relocation within a country to other local communities where you can provide safety is extremely important. But from a preventative perspective, I think it's key that early on we identify where these safe spaces are, and that we provide the support to those who can actually give them. And it's very surprising. No? It could be the neighbor, it could be a church congregation, it could be an NGO, it could be the UN. But it's definitely an area to explore very much and to keep working on. And we have a lot of support. The European Union has it, and you mentioned it, the ambassador mentioned it also as one of the projects that they need to work on. I think the UN, I heard the EU had helped about 60,000 human rights defenders, and it's of course very important. On neurotechnology, of course, human rights is an answer to it, and it's an important one. Again, we need to become granular, and we need to understand where the technology is going, and it's going faster than we think, because I was told even last year that while we may be able to read the brains of a mouse, it's a question of 10 years until you can actually, now I know we can, until you can write the brain of a mouse, but now and you can imagine what this means then for human beings. And of course, we know that all of this is going so much faster. Human rights do provide guardrails, but we need to go into a lot of detail. I always hear this ethics discussion around it. I'm always a bit worried about ethics alone, because ethics is not the answer. When it comes to obligations, we need to look at obligations, and human rights are obligations. This is hardcore stuff. So I think for the human rights community, the challenge is how do we translate these obligations into clear directives that help regulation, rather than making it an ethical discussion. Because ethics, some people want to be ethical, some people want to be unethical. And especially those who want to benefit from big profits, frankly, they have learned to be unethical for a very long time. So human rights is actually the answer to it, but it needs to be detailed and granular enough to be able to respond to this type of issues.
Thank you. I think that we can all agree that there were a lot of very thoughtful questions and a wide variety of topics that we broached this evening, and I'm very grateful to all of you for that. You made my job very, very easy, and I think you made for a very interesting discussion for all of us. And thank you again to the High Commissioner for taking the time to answer all of the questions, and Sophia as well for your work this evening. And I would like to invite everybody to a reception in the room next door, and thank you again for this wonderful evening.